Management and McKinsey are eager to fawn over the Chinese government, one of the most repressive regimes in the world. In an interview with China's government news service, for example, McKinsey's senior partner Peter Walker came off like a smitten teenager, all aflutter. Quote, "What I discovered in China was the people were happy. They were proud. They were energized. The government officials I met genuinely wanted to do the right thing for the people." Well, as it turned out, that was just a taste of Walker's effusive praise for the Communist government of China. Here's more.
I think the Chinese people have realized that whenever they're upset by anything that happens, whether it was the Sichuan earthquake or SARS or what's going on with the price of pork, I think the people speak out loud and clear, and I think the government is largely responsive. But, you know, to me, that's just part of a system where they define democracy as responsive to the people. And I think they tend to do that reasonably well.
Walker says he has visited mainland China at least 80 times over the course of his long career. He's also written a book. It's called Powerful, Different, Equal: Overcoming the Misconceptions and Differences Between China and the United States. Chinese state propaganda authorities have publicly praised Walker's book as helpful to their cause. After we aired last night's segment, the snippet of which we just showed you, Peter Walker contacted our office here and asked for the chance to come on the show and respond to what we said, and we're glad he did. Peter Walker joins us tonight. Mr. Walker, thank you so much for coming on. I want to get to something that you said. I want to start with the pandemic, because that's why we're talking about China in the first place. And I want to get to something that you said to Bloomberg Television last month, and I'm quoting you here. Yep. You said you were praising China's response to it, and you said, and I'm quoting, "When people look back at what was done with the magnitude of the quarantine in China, they are going to get high praise." Now, credible reports suggest that Chinese authorities locked people in their apartments and left them to die. We know they snatched people off the street and threw them into police vans. God knows where they went. That's the quarantine that you think they deserve high praise for. Why?
Well, I think, Tucker, if you just look at the results, okay, so I know there's always going to be questions about exactly what the numbers are, but I think the harsh action that they took, given the scale of China and the number of big cities in it, was exactly what they needed to do to be able to prevent the outbreak from going any further. And the reality is the outbreak hasn't gone much beyond Wuhan. Now, having said all that, am I happy about their lack of disclosure and lack of transparency? Absolutely not. They should be faulted for that. They should be accountable for that.
Okay. What would you say to the families of those who died, starved to death, alone in their apartments, or the people who are wondering where their relatives went after they were bundled into Chinese police vans? How would you square their grief with the praise you just heaped on the quarantine?
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, you just have to look at the total picture. It's like when Cuomo gets on every night and when Trump gets on every night. Everybody's heart has to go out to every individual who died. And it's part of the suffering that comes with this disease. And it's heartbreaking, every single one of them is. But they had to do it. Otherwise, if you could imagine the scale of China, if that blew out in large numbers to other cities, the numbers would be off the charts.
Well, Wuhan, where it began, is roughly the size of the New York metro area. We've lost more people in New York than the Chinese at least publicly admit they lost in Wuhan. Given that you are praising their response, do you think American authorities would be warranted in locking infected New Yorkers in their apartment until they starve to death? Well,
you know, I mean, the U.S., I think, got a late start when all is said and done. China got a late start, too. But I think the U.S. got a later start and was also more unprepared when it comes to having the kind of the people, staff, the health workers, the equipment that was required, the PPE,
for sure.
all of that.
I think that's right. But if we had started earlier, do you think it would have been wise to lock people in their apartments till they die?
No, look, I mean, there are a lot of things about China I don't like, and certainly those specific actions I think were overly harsh, were insensitive, and China bears the brunt of that. They're accountable for that. I totally agree.
Okay. Okay, so you said that you don't like some of the things China has done. I just want to go to something that you have said. This is from your website that you do like. You were asked about the Uyghurs. I'm sure you've been asked many times, and you were contrasting human rights in the U.S. and China. You said, in the U.S., human rights are inalienable and absolute. Human rights in China are relativist to be weighed against other societal needs. For example, you mentioned the Uyghurs, including food and shelter. You said, as an example, on the treatment of the Uyghurs, China would point to dramatic improvements in the Uyghurs' quality of life, and that would include over the last 50 years in terms of literacy, prosperity, and longevity, as well as a sharp reduction in Islamic terrorist incidents to the benefit of all Chinese. That's what China got out of putting 1 million people in concentration camps. Do you think that was a fair trade-off? It sounds like you do.
No, actually I don't. I understand that from the government's point of view, clamping down on Islamic terrorism was a high priority. And one of the things when you spend a lot of time in China, as I have, is they are fanatics about stability. Do I agree that locking down 1 million people in a internment camp is a smart way to deal with Islamic terrorism? Absolutely not.
But I wonder though, well, good. But may I ask, why would you note that their literacy had increased? I guess the obvious question is, who cares about your literacy if you're in a concentration camp?
Yeah, but you know, that's a good point, Tucker. So one of the things in researching my book that just became very clear to me, because a lot of times I said to the Chinese people, I said, you got a lot of things going for, why are you doing things the way you do? And one of the things you discover about the Chinese society, it's a collectivist society. So very different from the individualistic society of the U.S. So in China, literally the way they would look at it is there are probably 80 million people in Xinjiang where the Uyghurs live. We locked up 1 million, and so 79 million people are materially better off in terms of the quality of life, standard of living, and everything else. And it was only about 1.5% that we locked up. That's how they think about it. Do I agree with that? No, I don't agree with it. But that difference between collectivism and common good is a huge disconnect with the U.S. because we regard it, always have been proud of, every human life is sacred, and therefore any injustice is something we ought to be railing against, and they're just not wired that way.
Well, sure. And do you think it's when you say, well, let me just back up, do you think it's a genetic question when you said they're not wired that way?
No, it really goes back to Confucian values. You know, Confucian values, and I know there's been a lot of negative press on Confucian institutes, but if you just go back to Confucian values, one of the things you'll learn is family first, society second, individual way down the totem pole, and the individual's role is self-improvement through education to better serve family and society. So whenever you talk to the Chinese about how is the country doing, they always go back to the broad base of maximum number of people out of poverty, education, whatever it is.
Oh, I bet they do. I bet they do. I mean, that's a pretty handy way to excuse putting 1 million people in a concentration camp. I wonder, though, and I know it's hard, this is a problem in my life, it's hard to hear myself sometimes when I speak, but listening to you, this seems like a pure apology for fascist behavior.
Well, look, I mean, let me go back to what I said before. Do I agree with putting 1 million people in internment camps? Absolutely not. You know, the U.S. went through this too. I mean, we did this to the Japanese. Actually,
we didn't. Okay, so if you're going to try to draw the moral equivalence, let me just ask you the obvious question, because I don't think anyone would do this for free.
Yeah.
How much money have you made over the course of your long career with McKinsey in China? Would you just, if you could put a kind of rough estimate out there? It might be helpful to understand this.
Yeah, look, I'm not.
Just ballpark.
I probably spent a quarter of my time in China over the course of roughly a dozen years, something like that. And so, you know,
I guess the point I'm making is this country, in part at the urging of McKinsey, is now so economically tied to China that you got to wonder if the values you describe, which are repulsive, I think most Westerners would agree with that, exterminating individuals for the sake of the group is repulsive. I wonder if that's in fact hurting our country. Like, why would we want to be aligned with a government that grotesque? Is that a fair question, do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I'm a real pragmatist, Tucker. So the way I look at it is,
see.
we as a country made a real mistake in not protecting our intellectual property. But the cow's out of the barn. And the reality is the Chinese momentum behind their economy is very strong. And containment is too little, too late. So as a pragmatist, I just basically say, if China and the U.S. got together on the next coronavirus or got together on the Paris Accord or whatever the issue is, the world would be a better place.
But the two, and perhaps you're right, but to dismiss our present concerns as too far gone to fix is a little bit like setting a fire and then not calling the fire department because the building's a total loss. I mean, McKinsey is one of the reasons that we don't make pharmaceuticals or masks or a lot of machine tools or a million other things in this country because you all advised American companies to offshore the production. So do you regret that advice that you gave to American companies?
Well, look, I think we're in a different world now in terms of being much clearer about what really essential goods are or not. I think in the spirit of what McKinsey was advising, I think everybody was in favor of free trade in the sense of let every country do what they do well. And if you could take advantage of cheap, talented labor in China, which is not so cheap anymore, it was kind of something that improved the overall economic well-being globally. And the economists would say that. I think now that we're realizing the dependencies. I mean, how many Americans would have imagined that most of the ingredients for pharmaceuticals came from China and you're vulnerable? So I think this coronavirus
Did you think of that at the time? Because you had a, well, for sure, and that's why we're grateful that you're on tonight, because a lot of us have been awakened to this, but I'm wondering, as someone who had a front row seat to the process itself, most of us were sort of blissfully unaware, but you saw it happen. Did it ever occur to you, wait, maybe we should make some, I don't know, antibiotics in the United States? Maybe it's unwise as an American to abet the offshoring of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could always look back and say, I just know at that point in time, the economic model, which was both Democratic and Republican, was open free trade is maximum economic good for everybody. And I just don't think people really paid attention to what are the risks, what are the second order consequences. And frankly, one of the wake-up calls coming out of this virus is going to be people are going to sit down and say, what are we willing to give up in terms of economic efficiency in exchange for security? And that'll be a good discussion.
I think you're absolutely right.
Different decisions.
Amen. And I think that's absolutely true. So let me just end on this. You spent 46 years at McKinsey. You've written about it. You've obviously had a chance to think deeply about it. Do you regret participating in any of these trends, the ones that you say we should rethink?
Well, you know, the vast majority of my work related to China was for Chinese companies. And frankly, they were doing the same things. I mean, my world was the world of insurance. And so I helped a lot of Chinese insurance companies just do the basic things. And so it was get policies that provide better protection for consumers, communicate more clearly so people understand what the products are, be smart about how you price it, cut your costs when you can. So I really wasn't involved in the U.S.-China link directly. But, you know, if my McKinsey buddies were here today, I think they would say, as I have, that free trade was so the dominant mantra of the time that anything that could be done to foster that and make anything anywhere was pretty much unquestioned. And I, like I said, with this virus, we're going to revisit that. And, you know, it's not, I don't agree that there's going to be a huge increase in manufacturing jobs back here, because what's going to happen is a lot of their supply chains are going to go to the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam.
Oh, I bet.
And so the country is going to have to say, we're going to be willing to pay an extra X% for pharmaceuticals to have maximum safety. And I think that's a very fair question and fair trade-off.
So no regrets. Peter Walker, thanks so much for coming on tonight. I appreciate you doing that.
Well, thank you, Tucker. I've enjoyed it.